Contreras, and I'm senior engineer, the Safety Policy Division. And thank you, IT, for getting that recording started. So the purpose of today's workshop is to examine how the characteristics of small and multi-jurisdictional utilities and gas storage operators, which we'll collectively refer to today as small utilities, affect the applicability of the safety culture framework developed for the large investor-owned utilities. We also want to provide a forum for small utilities to discuss matters relevant to assessing their safety culture in the context of their differences from large utilities. So today, after hearing some remarks from Commissioner Hauk's office, SPD will provide an overview of the framework adopted and the assessment methodology envisioned for large IOUs, followed by a brief summary of the responses filed by the utilities on their safety culture assessment practices. There will then be an opportunity for questions for SPD and the small utilities on their practices. This is also a time for the utilities to clarify any items they find relevant about the practices summarized by SPD. We'll then hear from Dr. Mark Fleming, our subject matter expert, on the considerations for assessing the safety culture of small organizations. So just to note, we did add some time for questions for Dr. Fleming, which was not in the original agenda circulated previously, but we will still shoot to end on time with the roundtable of the small utility representatives and Dr. Fleming. So just a few reminders. As you heard earlier, the meeting is being recorded, and we will post it to SPD's Safety Culture and Governance website for future reference. The slides will also be shared with the service list after the workshop. There will be opportunities for questions and discussion, as I mentioned earlier, but in addition to those two question sessions, and time permitting at the end of the roundtable, we may have some time for additional questions from the roundtable panelists. So please raise your hand to be called upon or put your question in the chat during the Q&A sessions. We'll try to answer all questions here today, but staff will follow up with and answer questions. Before we get started, I do want to hand it over to Commissioner Hauk's office for some opening remarks. I believe, Ben, you are on the call, so I'll hand it over to you if you are.
That's correct. Thanks, Carolina. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ben Menzies, and I'm an advisor to Commissioner Darcy Hauk, who's the assigned commissioner for this proceeding. Commissioner Hauk regrets that she's unable to attend the workshop, but is very interested in the discussion today. That being said, I'm glad to be with you for these important discussions on assessing safety culture for small and multi-jurisdictional gas and electric utilities and independent gas storage operators. Thank you to all the parties in this proceeding and interested members of the public for your participation and valuable insights. I also want to thank CPUC staff from Safety Policy Division for their work on this proceeding and for hosting the workshop. And a special thank you to our presenting subject matter expert joining us today, Dr. Mark Fleming. The purpose of today's workshop is to discuss opportunities and challenges in adapting the safety culture assessment framework adopted in the Phase 1 decision to the unique circumstances of small and multi-jurisdictional gas and electric utilities and independent gas storage operators. As Commissioner Hauk has emphasized, safety culture is a top priority for the Commission. While the regulated entities we will be discussing today are smaller than the utilities who were the subject of the Phase 1 decision, safety and an accompanying safety culture that appropriately prioritizes and ensures safety as a core component of each company's business is no less critical. No matter the size or scope of the utility, gaps in safety culture can lead to dangerous outcomes for ratepayers and the general public, and must be addressed in a thoughtful, evidence-based, and collaborative manner. At the same time, we recognize that there are relevant differences in organizational structure and safety considerations between these entities and the utilities addressed in Phase 1. The goal here is to adopt mechanisms for safety culture assessments that are reasonable, feasible, and promote accountability in ensuring safety is a core priority for regulated entities. Thank you again for your attendance and participation in this workshop, and I look forward to the agenda and sharing your insights with Commissioner Howe. Back to you, Carolina.
Thank you for sharing those words, Ben. We will move on to the first presentation of the day by the Safety Policy Division. So I'll provide a brief overview of the framework adopted for the large utilities. Now, to help everyone prepare for today's discussions, we did share some reference documents ahead of time, and I have added these to the chat. So please make sure you go on there if you do need to refresh your memory on those. Just ease of access. So we'll start with the framework and then move to the comprehensive assessment methodology. The CPUC Safety Culture Assessment Framework was adopted by the Commission in January of this year by Decision R.21-10-001, and it applies to large gas and electric IOUs. It consists of 6 main elements, and these are listed on the slides. It's a set of goals and guiding principles to guide the engagements, definitions for safety and safety culture, a normative framework, which is the ideal vision of what a healthy safety culture would look like, a comprehensive assessment of safety culture to be performed every 4 years, an annual self-improvement evaluation to monitor progress in between assessments, and the Utility Safety Culture Working Group for collaborative effort to refine the framework and support continued improvement of culture at the utilities. So I'll go over some of these key elements next. The framework and the related engagements are guided by a set of goals and principles that will be reviewed periodically. The 5 areas of focus underscore embedding safety as a core value beyond compliance, fostering collaboration to better identify and manage risks, integrating operational safety into safety culture to prevent catastrophic events. This is a very important point. It supports the need to increase focus on prevention of major incidents, such as those low probability, high consequence events like San Bruno, the Paradise wildfires, or Aliso Canyon leak, which are beyond just the occupational safety hazards or the workplace safety hazards that are often associated with safety culture. Adopting a systemic approach. And the systemic approach to safety culture means understanding and improving safety culture by considering the whole organization as an interconnected system, rather than focusing on individual behavior or isolated events. Developing tools to monitor and assess culture. The key principles guiding this engagement emphasize fostering a shared understanding of safety culture across all stakeholders. This will be necessary to ensure everybody's talking the same language. So for some of you attending today's workshop, some of the material you've heard before. For some of you, like the small utilities who might have not been as engaged in the first phase of the proceeding, some of this might actually be very new. So you will continue hearing SPD repeat a lot of concepts and hopefully get us to a point where we will all align and understand and speak apples to apples when it comes to the safety culture concepts. Engaging a wide range of stakeholders as may be necessary, ensuring privacy and confidentiality of individual workers, promoting open communication and reporting, learning and continuous improvement, recognition that the regulator can influence safety culture of regulated entities, and non-punitive collaboration to strengthen safety culture, and the notion that IOUs have full ownership and responsibility for their safety culture. Now, the Commission also adopted definitions for safety culture and safety, as noted on the slide. There were some additional working definitions that were promoted but I'll focus today on these two definitions that were adopted. So in these definitions, safety culture is not considered as separate from organizational culture, but rather as a subset of the organization's own culture. So safety culture is also not just collective behaviors and practices, which are those things that can be readily observed, like policies and procedures, and which are often confused for safety culture. Rather, and very important to remember, the definition includes the collective beliefs, values, and norms shared by the utilities workforce, which are intangible and cannot be observed directly. So these definitions also inform the scope of the assessment, particularly in that all workers that impact risk and safety are included in the assessment. Safety itself includes all the domains relevant to the prevention of harm to people, assets, and the environment. This is important because it means that the CPUC's assessments go beyond one, the risk of wildfire for, let's say, electric utilities, and two, beyond just occupational safety or safety of workers, which has often been the focus of many organizations when considering safety culture. So while that focus is fine for a company that makes, let's say, paper, for example, it's not appropriate for organizations with high risk operations like the utilities. So this need was recognized by the Commission in its goals for the framework, which include focusing on incorporating operational safety into safety culture to help prevent catastrophic events. So two main things to take away about these definitions are that, one, policies and procedures do not make up a utility's safety culture. And second, safety in the context of culture is more than addressing workplace hazards. There are already regulators that oversee worker safety, like OSHA. Utility assets and operations present safety risks to the public and the environment, so which are beyond the realm of occupational safety and which the Commission does oversee. Now, a normative framework against which the culture would be assessed was also adopted by the Commission. Normative frameworks generally help in communicating or describing generally what a healthy culture, safety culture looks like. So this framework was adopted from the 10 traits agreed between the US NRC, which is the US Nuclear Regulatory Commission, and INPO, which is the industry organization for nuclear power plants and power operators. So they collectively define a healthy safety culture. And in this sense, it outlines an ideal direction for organization to strive towards, not a checklist of things they need to have, but just a path, a place where they should strive to be at. So in terms of process, here is a visual representation of how we expect the work to flow for an IOU's assessment cycle. A cycle is a 4-year period, beginning with a utilities comprehensive safety culture assessment. I won't go through all of these boxes, but these should provide an understanding of how the different activities fit together. It begins with a comprehensive assessment, followed by utilities developing plans and actions in response to the assessment findings, and followed by a process of continuous improvement, which was described in the appendix to the decision adopting the framework. This improvement process consists of the utilities refining their plans and interventions for improvement in response to monitoring the progress they're making based on annual improvement self-evaluations in the intervening years between assessments. So that's where you see the cycle for the 3 years to the right of the workflow. And the cycle ends with incorporating improvements to the assessment framework itself based on learnings from the past cycle into the new cycle that starts with another comprehensive assessment on the 5th year. Some of the key features of the large IOU assessments relevant to today's discussion are that, again, and this is going to sound repetitive, but I don't think we can say it enough, is that these go beyond occupational safety to address drivers of high consequence, low probability events that impact the public. And again, when I say drivers, I mean cultural drivers of those events. So, examples of those type of events are the San Bruno pipeline explosion, the Paradise wildfire, and Elysium gas storage leak. They cover all safety risks presented by the IOU's operations. So these will go beyond wildfire safety risk. And the assessment applies to both large electric and gas utilities. They are comprehensive. This means basically that they are intended to provide a deep and rich picture of safety culture, including the underlying values, the beliefs, and norms. Doing a deep dive of this sort, though, is a large-scale effort and only possible because the frequency of the assessments is every 4 years. It would not be feasible or useful to perform an assessment of this scale any more frequently, while also allowing time for meaningful progress and improvement. The assessments, as I mentioned earlier, they use the normative framework against which the culture would be assessed, and they must be performed by a third-party evaluator. So now we'll focus on the main component of the framework, which is the safety culture assessment. So the framework adopted by the Commission is based on performing a comprehensive safety culture assessment, which is described as systematic, using a multi-method approach consisting of surveys, document reviews, interviews, focus groups, and site observations, which represent both qualitative and quantitative methods. The data is to be triangulated across the methods. It should provide a rich picture of the culture with strengths and weaknesses relative to the normative framework, conclusions and actionable recommendations so the IOU may identify suitable interventions. It also strives to reduce and mitigate potential bias. So the general approach was informed by the goals and principles for this engagement. We envision that this approach for assessment focuses on identifying the underlying assumptions of the safety culture, rather than the symptoms, which are those visible manifestations of the culture. This would be aligned with the systemic approach set forth in the goals adopted by the Commission. We expect the comprehensive assessment to go beyond capturing employee perceptions, so it would not be a perception-led assessment. And consistent with the decision, data would be triangulated across the different data collection methods to extract cultural themes and related signals. It also would be, we envision it to be rooted in the International Atomic Energy Agency's assessment methodology. As we understand, this methodology is regarded as a best practice for comprehensive assessments by international experts and regulators. It is also strongly aligned with the goals and principles adopted for the CPUC's assessment. Now, the IAEA methodology is based on SHINE's 3-level model for safety culture, represented by the iceberg figure to the right of the slide. So here we have some of the unique features that characterize the IAEA methodology. So first, it applies the same multi-method approach supported by a framework with both quantitative and qualitative data collection methods, but it is predominantly qualitative, which allows for that deep and rich picture of the culture with narrative-driven insights into how safety is experienced and prioritized across levels of the organization. It emphasizes continuous improvement and learning over compliance and promotes system thinking. All these properties are supported by the goals and principles adopted for the CPUC framework. The IAEA methodology does go beyond surface level behaviors and compliance to examine the underlying beliefs, norms, and systemic interactions. So therefore, it focuses on understanding the root of the issues rather than just the symptoms. So the symptoms are those surface level items that you see at the tip of the iceberg represented in the graphic to the right. So consistent with the CPUC's assessment expectations, it triangulates data across the multiple methods employed to identify systemic patterns. The IAEA also views safety culture as a dynamic emergent property of the entire organizational system, which is consistent with our definition of safety culture as well. So the assessment is tailored to the organizational context and encourages self-reflection and internal ownership. The latter feature, which is also supported by the principles of our assessment framework. And finally, the end goal of these assessments, the IAEA assessment methodology, that is to provide insights for improvement rather than an evaluation for compliance. So this is an important feature, as one key goal adopted by the Commission is to institutionalize safety as a core priority beyond just compliance. Now, the methodology uses the 5 methods required by the CPUC framework, which are a survey, document review, interviews, focus groups, and site observations. A unique aspect about the methodology is that the data is gathered concurrently rather than in a sequence. So this ensures capturing the broadest possible insights so that nothing is missed, and it reduces bias. So this is different from what some other multi-method approaches may employ. Those other approaches usually consist of a sequential process, which is represented in the graphic on the slide. This graphic is an example of how one method is used to inform the data collection of subsequent methods. The example here focuses on gathering perceptions, which are subsequently confirmed or verified by interviews, focus groups, or observations or document reviews. So that would technically be a perception-led assessment, even though it is multi-method. Now, so this graphic shows the data is collected, how the data is collected and analyzed independently from the other. Basically, the methods do not inform a collection and analysis of another, which is what we just went over in the previous slide. Patterns or cultural themes are then gathered by triangulating across the multiple methods. And the overarching patterns are then compared to the normative framework. And in our case, that would be the 10 traits adapted from the US NRC input framework. So we envision informing the assessment lens from those promulgated by the Canadian Energy Regulator, which are listed here. These focus on identifying commonalities and differences across the collection methods, examples to help illustrate the patterns found, differences between what is said versus what is written and or observed, differences and similarities between subgroups and significant observations on patterns of behavior related to safety commitment and tolerance of risk, amongst others. So at the Commission, we've had experience overseeing an assessment of this kind. Here you'll find a link to a safety culture assessment report that employed the IAEA methodology. And it is the same link shared as reference material for the workshop. Again, if you check the chat, I've added all that reference material and the links for your ease of access. Now, I'll just do we'll be summarizing essentially the safety culture assessment practices reported on by the small utilities. So the small utilities filed responses to the April 23rd, 2025 ALJ ruling requesting information on their current safety culture assessment practices and other details pertinent to the phase 2 of this proceeding. So this slide just summarizes the responses filed. Again, this is just a reference slide for everyone. We'll have time after this presentation for questions from participants for the utility representatives or SPD, and for the small utilities to clarify anything they find pertinent. So for context, there were 10 responding small utilities. 3 provide electric service, 3 provide natural gas, either transmission and distribution or just distribution, and 4 are independent gas storage operators. So although all are grouped as small utilities or small multi-jurisdictional utilities, their workforce sizes do range widely. So with 7 employees being the smallest, and that's Alpine Gas, a gas distribution company, to 4,700 being the largest, and that's PacifiCorp, an electric multi-jurisdictional utility. So it's worth noting, though, that these numbers do exclude contractors. Now, 7 out of the 10 companies have less than 50 employees, which excludes contractors and leadership or management staff at the parent company's headquarters. This means only 2 electric and 1 gas utility have over 50 employees. Most of the small utilities, as in 8 of the 10, report retaining contractors for work that includes maintenance, engineering, and or construction. These are all activities that impact safety. Only the 2 smallest utilities, both of which are gas utilities, reported not using contractors at all. All respondents reported performing some sort of activity to identify cultural strengths or vulnerabilities with varying degrees of formality, as would be expected. Most, as in 7 out of the 10, relied on surveys or questionnaires of some sort to gather employee perceptions or feedback, either annually, biannually, or triannually. And we did observe that, with exception of those who participated in the OEIS Safety Culture Survey, the extent to which these surveys focused on safety culture varied or wasn't clear from the responses. The remaining 3 utilities reported more informal means of gathering cultural insights, and those include collection of employee suggestion cards, review of leak and maintenance report, or annual review of incident trends, which are, all fairly limited in terms of providing cultural insights. Of those reporting using surveys or questionnaires, all reported maintaining anonymity of the workforce. Except for 2 gas utilities, all operate under a parent company structure and report varying degrees of parent company involvement in safety culture. 2 reported no involvement at all by parent company. 2 reported the parent company setting or overseeing safety policies and or audits. 1 reported providing reports to the board, and 1 reported participation of parent company employees who work on site in the survey. So again, we will share these slides after the meeting for your reference. And these are just the same observations I went over, summarized for your reference. So before moving right into questions, I'd like to check with the small utilities in case there are any clarifying comments that they have with respect to the summary of practices provided by SPD. So let me go back to that slide. And please raise your hands if there are any clarifying comments or questions from the small utility representatives today. Okay. Well, I don't see any questions. Perhaps during the roundtable that some clarifications might pop up, but happy to take any questions anybody has regarding the large IOU framework and the comprehensive assessments before we move on to Dr. Fleming's presentation. Don't be shy. Okay, well, with no questions, on the line, we will move on to Dr. Fleming's presentation. Dr. Fleming is a professor from St. Mary's University with experience assessing small. He's going to present on the considerations that we should potentially keep in mind with respect to assessing small organizations. Dr. Fleming became the first professor of safety culture focused on developing practical tools to assist organizations prevent harm. And he's currently involved in researching safety culture in a wide range of industries and advises numerous regulators and organizations on safety culture assessment and improvement. He also provides expertise for the North American Regulator Safety Culture Working Group, to which the CPUC, OEIS, FEMSA, and the Canadian Energy Regulator belong to, as well as other North American regulators. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Fleming, and over to you.
Thanks, Carolina, and hopefully people can see my presentation.
Yes, we can see it.
Great. Okay. So thanks everyone for giving the opportunity to talk about this topic. There's going to be a certain amount of overlap between the material that Carolina has shared and some of the information that I'm going to share with you today. Just because we're covering the same sort of material, I think it's helpful for people to have a clear sort of understanding and sort of background. So there's going to be a bit of overlap, but that's probably helpful. And the purpose of this presentation is to sort of get you to think about this a bit and also create an opportunity for some discussion, because I think that's the most useful aspect of these meetings. So what I'm going to talk about, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the background to safety culture, why it's important, what its nature it is, some discussion of approaches to assessment, and that's where Carolina's and mine approaches will overlap a little bit, and then talk a bit about conducting assessments in small utilities and what that looks like, and then some conclusions. So when we think about safety culture, you know, the term has been with us for many years. So it was initially coined in the investigation into the Chernobyl disaster in the former Soviet Union in 1986. So we're going on now for 40 years in terms of that particular disaster. And we have had the term there since then. So that's where the term originated. And really, since that disaster in Chernobyl, the term safety culture has been used in many other disasters, the King's Cross fire in the UK. Personally, myself, the Piper Alpha disaster is how I got involved in safety culture. I was an undergraduate student in Aberdeen in Scotland at the time, and you couldn't live in that relatively small city and not be impacted and know about the disaster that occurred where 167 people died in an offshore platform explosion and fire in 1988. And over the years, Clapham Junction rail disaster, BP Texas City explosion in 2005 in North America, again identified safety culture as a contributory factor. Deepwater Horizon, again in the Gulf of Mexico, again, and a rig operated by British Petroleum, again resulted in the change in how offshore drilling and was regulated in the Gulf of Mexico and in the US, and created a new agency, BESI, as a result of the poor culture in drilling in the Gulf of Mexico. San Bruno in California, again identified cultural issues surrounding PG&E. And in Canada here, where I'm located, the Lac-Mégantic rail disaster. And all of these tragic events, when the public inquiries and investigations into these events were concluded, they identified a poor safety culture as a contributory factor to those disasters. So much of the work and the work that I do is to look at why organizations have disasters what we can learn from them to make the likelihood of them occurring in the future far less likely. So that's what safety culture is about. It's about major hazard risk, and as Carolina said, those low probability, high consequence events. Safety culture becomes one of the really important components to look at when we're trying to prevent those things from occurring. So what do we mean by the term safety culture? So lots of people throw it around. It's if you Google it, it's one of the, it has a huge hit rate, higher than risk assessment. So it's a really popular term around safety. Lots of people use it and generally misuse it, if the truth be told. So it's an abstract concept. So it's something a term that people made up to describe the collective failure to implement known controls to prevent catastrophic events. So all of the events that I just talked about were events that they had controls to manage. They were risks that were well understood. There was processes and practices that should have been in place that would have prevented the disaster from occurring, and yet they still occurred. So what we find, rather than trying to blame one individual or one person who didn't do the right thing, what we tend to find is that it's a collective failure. It's a whole group of people within the organization who fail to implement these known controls. And these known controls have not been implemented, not on just this one occasion. It was not just bad luck. It was going to happen sooner or later. And it just happened that that sequence of events unfolded the way it did on that particular day. An important thing for people to think about when we talk about safety culture is that prior to the event, the people who ran the organization, both the senior leaders and the frontline staff, believed they were safe, right? So often when we look at a disaster after the fact, we can see all these failures that are very glaring and obvious. But before the event occurred, the people running the system believed that they were safe. And that, I think, is what makes safety culture interesting. It is that thing where we have this sort of conflict between safety being really important to an organization, yet they fail dramatically in terms of implementing their controls. Safety was a priority in the organization. For example, for Deepwater Horizon, many of the people who were on the installation, on the drilling rig, the Transocean, that night, were BP executives giving the rig an award for their safety achievements. So it wasn't that safety wasn't a priority. It was just the way how they were thinking about safety and how they were imagining how safety was being managed was the issue. So it would be nice and reassuring for us to say, oh, bad companies do bad things. Those companies weren't well run. Nobody cared about safety. That's why they had the disaster. But the reality is, the companies that have disasters are often those who, prior to the disaster, would have been seen as leaders in that particular area and leaders in safety. For example, the Chernobyl nuclear plant was recognized as a safety-conscious nuclear power plant. In fact, the disaster was caused by them trying to do a safety test to try to work out how they could operate under low power without a diesel generator, which is a risky situation, which ultimately led to the meltdown. But from their perspective, what they were doing was actually trying to enhance safety. And there was lots of failures and lots of things that they did incorrectly. But if we had done a perception survey in Chernobyl before the disaster, I'm reasonably confident they would have got a pretty high positive responses because they really believed they were safe. So safety culture is really useful in understanding how low probability, high consequence events can occur. So disasters and fatalities. And what I'm trying to get you to think about is, first of all, that it's a concept we've made up to explain a phenomena that we observe repeatedly, disaster after disaster after disaster. So this is a pretty consistent finding, and we're trying to understand why this happens. And this is a helpful idea or concept to help us get our head around this. So on the basis of what I've just explained, it's important to understand the sort of the nature of safety culture. And often, particularly people who have more of an engineering technical background, can struggle a little bit with this as an idea. So safety culture is a construct. It's an idea It's not an object. It's not something that you can touch or feel. And it's not a piece of paper. It's not a document. It's not even a response to a survey. It's a concept that we have created to explain a phenomena that we observe in the real world. So it's a concept that we have created, and it has proved to be useful within organizations. And it helps us capture some of the non-tangible aspects of safety, which can be harder to pick up on. And to sort of think about this, you can have two companies that on paper look exactly the same in terms of their management practices and rules and procedures and the regulations that govern those two organizations. Yet their outcomes in terms of safety can be very, very different. And that difference between what's maybe documented and what happens in practice, that's really where culture lives. And that's the thing we're trying to capture in that sort of context. It's about that, the non-tangible aspects of safety. So sometimes people really want to get concrete and say it is this and put and nail it to the wall. And that seems very, very attractive. But by definition, in terms of what we mean by the construct, that's not really possible, right? It is in itself abstract, and losing that abstract means we lose the meaning and the benefit of the concept. So although it makes people somewhat uncomfortable, it's actually a really important feature. It's not a bug, it's a feature. So when we think about what safety culture is, it influences how group members think about risk and safety. What is the nature of safety? What does being safe mean? How is it viewed? So when we think about safety, do we see it as a problem? Do we see it as a process? Do we see it as a business driver? How we even just talk about safety is part of the culture. And again, who has got agency and power over safety? So is it something that senior leaders, force on a frontline staff, or is it something that is done in a collaborative way, or is it that the people who are at the sharp end have the control over managing safety? All of these things sort of go to sort of make up the culture. There's a lot of variability in terms of how different companies' cultures, what they look like. And that doesn't mean we need to always put them on a good, bad continuum, but it just means that different companies with different cultures achieve things in different ways, and it's important to be aware of that. So there isn't just one size fits all or one idea of good. There's a lot more variability in that sort of concept. So hopefully you sort of got an idea of some of the abstract nature of safety culture. So I like to use this metaphor for people to get their head around this, because I do really think it's an important concept for people to cover. So I use love as a metaphor for safety culture. And if you sort of see the two concepts together, I think it helps you maybe appreciate the subtleties of safety culture and also why it is so important. So with love, it's hard to describe, but you know it when you see it. So if you see two people who love each other, you can recognize that, but you don't necessarily know it beforehand. So I think that is a really important aspect. You cannot directly assess love, and I think trying to do that probably wouldn't make a lot of sense to people, saying, "Oh well, I love that person 7.6 out of 10, but I only love this person 7.2." I mean, it's just not how it works. It doesn't work in that sort of way. It isn't an object, so again, it's intangible, but you can possess it. So you can love someone, but it's not a particular object. You can infer it from a range of indicators. So you can make some judgments around the extent to which people love each other. Is what people say. How much do I love thee? Let me count the ways. What people do. They go away on romantic weekends. They get married. They give each other gifts. There's many behaviors and observable things that we can see that are maybe associated with two people loving each other. But what's important is not to confuse these activities with the love itself, right? It's a reflection of the love, but it's not the actual love the person feels for the person. So there is this sort of disconnect between maybe the indicators and the thing, and you have to be aware of that, because it's quite easy to confuse maybe the behavioral manifestations of something with the actual thing. So it's the romantic weekend is not the love, it is a product of it. And also, there's a lot of variability between people. So how people demonstrate and show love and affection to each other varies a lot. So some people, it might be, buying each other flowers or gifts, and in other people, it might be completely different. It might be going for a walk on a beach. So there's a lot of variability, and it's very, very hard to sort of enforce one right approach to a couple. And it is easy to sort of misinterpret the indicators. So sometimes people get, oh, well, you should go out on date nights and those sorts of things. And that may work for some people and some couples, but not necessarily for everyone. So sometimes it's easy to misinterpret the indicators. And probably what's more helpful in terms of a relationship is to look at changes rather than the presence and absence of indicators. So if a couple typically went on romantic weekends away together and then they stopped, then that might tell you something about the nature of where their relationship is going. It could be related to something else, like financial difficulties. They can't afford it anymore, and that would make sense. But it's the change and why it's changed that tells you a lot more about your culture. And I think that's a really important thing to think about. So I've spent a long time sort of talking about this, but the thing that I find organizations and people get stuck and get lost when they're talking about safety culture is that they try to turn it into a very objective thing. And when you do that, you lose the benefit of it, and it's not so helpful. So I think that's why it's really key that you sort of take away that idea that this isn't a concept, not an object, and that is what makes it important. Carolina's already talked about this. So this is based on Edgar Schein's model of organizational culture, which talks about artifacts, espoused values, and basic assumptions. So we have the visible things, which is the sort of iceberg above the water, the artifacts. We have the espoused values, which sort of are above and below the water. And then we have the driving force, which is the basic assumptions, which are at the bottom of the iceberg and less visible. And these are the things that really drive safety. These are the reasons why we do things. So this model, I'm going to come back to it a little bit later, but it's important that we sort of think about again how culture can consist of different layers. We have some visible things that can be easy to see and can be sort of a distraction to really what's going on underneath. So the example that I sometimes give for this is that I was at a presentation years ago in Aberdeen about, it was an executive from a large oil and gas company, and he said, the best indicator he had for a good safety culture was, did the safety manager have a reserved parking space? Because in a company, the number of reserved parking spaces is limited. And so if the safety person is really a senior leader and treated as such, they'll have a reserved parking space. But if they don't, it shows them that they're not really a senior leader, they just have a title. And that was great, really good example of an artifact. You could see how that was connected to some basic assumptions and values an organization would have. So, but by the next week, all of the safety managers in contracting companies had reserved parking spaces, right? Because they were all trying to sell to this large company and they wanted to be seen to have a good safety culture. So they all just adopted that. So the safety managers were winners because they all got reserved parking spaces, but it didn't really increase their status. It just meant this is an indicator, so we'll just fake it so that we convince this large company that we are committed to safety. So, that's the problem with artifacts. They can give you insight, but they're easy to fake. So also, when we do these assessments and we try to maybe have indicators around safety culture, they're easy to misinterpret. So sometimes people say, you can get a survey result, 75% of agreed leaders are committed to safety. Sometimes you see that expressed as 25% of managers are not committed. And that's just telling you they haven't understood what that's telling you, right? You're looking at perceptions that people have of leaders. You don't know how the extent to which that reflects any reality. So perceptions are not facts, they require interpretation. So just because they give you a number doesn't really mean that they are the same as other types of numbers. So perceptions, while they can seem quite concrete, are actually, again, require some interpretation. I'm going to talk about that a bit more in a minute. humble inquiry, and that's a sort of a methodology that we sort of our stance that we approach when we approach doing assessment is to try and really understand things. It needs some openness and self-criticism. We need to be able to think about what does this mean. And when we talk about safety culture assessment, there's a wide range of approaches out there, some with very questionable validity. So it seems to me that everybody's an expert in safety culture these days, and that everybody's claiming they've done this, that, and the next thing. But actually, I have been working in this field for 30 years, and I'm still learning today, and still refining my approaches. And yet, people who have never done an assessment before are able to describe themselves as experts, which is a little bit concerning. So safety culture surveys, and from the information that Carolina presented, is something that small utilities do from time to time, and is quite common across the industry. And a safety culture survey is useful. They gather information from numerical data from employees. It can be quite efficient. In general, we would only really do surveys with organizations that are above 100 employees. You can do it with slightly less, but broadly speaking, it's really useful for larger size companies over 100 employees. And they produce numerical data. You can ensure anonymity because the survey doesn't have anyone's name on it. And it's easy to compare the perceptions over time and able to identify trends. So surveys are a very useful process. They can provide useful information when used appropriately. The limitations is that a safety culture survey is not a safety culture assessment, right? It's just a perception survey. It can provide you with useful information, but in and of itself, it's not an assessment. There's limited in-depth understanding of the context, motivation behind the responses, what's driving them. The survey response can bring in bias and lead to misinterpretation. So you need to be sort of careful about how the questions are worded, and good quality surveys that's been validated are actually rarer than you would imagine. And then there's a low response rate that could affect reliability of the data. So if only 20% of people respond, you can be pretty confident that the 20% who responded are different from the 80% who did not, just by definition of those who responded. And sometimes, particularly companies who do political surveying, say, oh, well, we're going to adjust it based on, the distribution of the population. Again, I think that's misunderstanding what they're trying to capture. I'm going to answer more questions about that if people are interested in, but low response rate is a problem. So another common approach to doing some safety culture work is to do surveys plus focus groups and interviews, either just focus groups or both focus groups and interviews. The strengths of this is that it's helpful, gives people some multiple methods, gives some insight into why people have those perceptions, so it's quite useful. Identifies concerns and potential solutions, so it's a very helpful process. It only captures espoused values. And when they're combined, particularly with focus groups and interviews, often managers experience it as a long list of complaints, a whole bunch of things that employees would like fixed. And often it can be quite difficult for them to engage in an improvement process based on the results, because it seems like just a lot of moaning. There's a tendency then when you look at those list of issues identified, they tended to be much more occupational safety concerns. So it tends to be a long list of things like personal protective equipment that they are concerned about. And it often, this approach to assessment doesn't get into why these perceptions may exist. So often it's quite a thin analysis that's done. And just to sort of illustrate that, when we think about it in terms of the iceberg model, the perceptions really are only capturing the espoused values. So it's only picking that middle layer of the process. So even though you put a lot of effort in and you do multiple methods, you're really only capturing the espoused value. And the way this has been said to me by a manager, it's describing the water to a drowning man. It tends to be somewhat negatively focused, tends to be a long list of issues to be fixed. It doesn't tell you anything about the why, and doesn't tell you anything about the basic assumptions that are driving things in terms of improvement. So while the dominant approach to safety culture assessment in North America is this employee perception approach, which if interviews, surveys, and focus groups, they often or typically do not get at the basic assumptions and artifacts, because they're really just trying to describe what employees think is important in terms of safety. So what do we mean then by a comprehensive assessment? Again, Caroline has covered this already, but it tends to include multiple methods as well. But it has, in addition to the perception ones, it'll have field observations and document analysis. And that makes it different in and of itself. But the more important part is the analysis of looking for the overarching themes, the understanding why these observations and this data exists. This analysis process is the thing that's probably the most critical part, where we look at the individual themes from each of the methods, and then we say, well, why is all this happening? What does this tell us about the culture? So there's this interpretive approach, interpretation of the data, that actually is the secret sauce. That's the part that makes this really important and useful, because it gets you into the basic assumptions. You collect the data from the artifacts of espoused values, you interpret it, and you get into this basic assumption piece where you can start to understand why all of this happens, because you've collected so much information about the organization. So what makes a comprehensive assessment different from other types of assessment is actually much more to do with the interpretation analysis of the data than it is just simply about collecting more data, right? So if you didn't do that comprehensive sort of analysis, you would not get to the same understanding of why those perceptions, beliefs, practices, activities exist. So it's the why part that is really important to that sort of process. So when we talk about small company assessments, they are different than big ones. So smaller companies are less complex to collect data, right? So it tends to be smaller just because of the nature of the organization. So if you've got 100 employees, it's a much smaller, shorter type of assessment that you're doing. And you're going to collect less data because the organization is smaller. So they're going to be much smaller in their approach. Surveys are of less value or not appropriate under 50 employees, just because the reliability of the data is not there. The extent to which people are going to be anonymous at under 50 employees is not there. Your response rate is going to be problematic. One or two outliers are going to distort any averages that you create. So once you get to smaller numbers, it really becomes less and less helpful. There's no absolute cutoff, but in general, as you get to smaller organizations, the surveys become less helpful. Document analysis become more important, right? So understanding what's going on in practice, looking at the documents and the output of the system becomes a bigger part of the data collection piece, and trying to understand how common small company challenges are described and recognized. So one of the challenges that small companies typically have is a lack of specialist resources, a lot of specialists or technical expertise. How do they cope with that? How do they manage those challenges becomes an issue. How they interact with contractors, how they have the capacity and competence to oversee those contractors and ensure they're doing quality work starts to become the focus of those cultural things. So the stories that we end up telling about how we can get away with things and how we manage these dilemmas becomes important. And the purpose for all assessments, but it's particularly important in a small organization, is to understand how the culture that we have in our organization influences how we manage risk. So what is it we do to sort of cope with the challenges we experience on a day-to-day basis, and how that influences our risk management strategies? Are we able to have the sort of open conversations? Are we able to acknowledge some of the limitations we have in terms of managing hazards? And then how do we cope with that? Because smaller organizations tend to have stronger interpersonal bonds, it can be difficult to deal with a employee who has maybe been there for a long time, but now is underperforming, or maybe has some other personal challenges that they're experiencing. So often there's a tendency to sort of ignore and cover up because they don't want to deal with that. which is at a very interpersonal level, someone who you've known, who you live with, who's in the community with you, much more challenging to deal with those issues in a small company. So those small company issues influence the culture. And then just to go back to this diagram of a comprehensive assessment, and all I'm really trying to say here is that it's a bit smaller, that's why the picture's smaller, that the relative size of the observation and document analysis is going to get bigger in comparison to the perception focus group information. One of the things that really influences people's perceptions of safety is how much they like their job and how much they like their supervisor, managers, and peers. And in general, in smaller companies, that tends to be more positive. So that data becomes not useful, but often isn't maybe as helpful as you might think in that context, right? So we need to often sort of look at the contrast between those things a bit more. So we tend to put slightly less weight on the focus groups interview surveys if we do them in comparison to other data sources that we would have. So just to sort of conclude, safety culture is an important object, but it's an important construct, but it's not an object. Avoid simplistic approaches. So there's often a real desire for people who work in this area or who are trying to work in culture for the first time to have a sense of objectivity. I want to know that this company's culture is getting a 4 out of a 5 or an 8 out of a 10, and they need to improve. So we often want this sense of concrete scores on the door so we can measure something. And unfortunately, that's just not going to work. And therefore, people need to develop more sophisticated understanding of the nature of culture and why it's important, right? It's important in terms of how it influences how we manage risk. And if we understand how the culture is influencing risk, we can manage risk more effectively. That's the purpose of the assessment. Small companies are going to need a different mix of data collection methods, but it's got the same objective. We want insight into how our safety culture is influencing how we manage risk, and particularly those low probability, high consequence events. And the real output of an assessment is not to say how great you are, but rather to say, what did you learn? What is the insight you have gained from this sort of activity? So thanks for your attention, and I'll hand it back to Carolina. I'll maybe stop sharing. I can work out to do that.
Thank you so much for those insights, Dr. Fleming. Those are very helpful, and hopefully can get us started with our roundtable with the small utilities. But before we do move on to the roundtable, I just want to open it up to everybody in this workshop, see if you have any questions for Dr. Fleming, and just make sure you take advantage of his expertise while we're here so that we can further inform our proceeding.
Not a question, but thank you, Doctor. Excellent.
Thank you.
And I see Mr. Howard, Ted Howard, you have your hand raised.
Yes, hi, thank you. I'm Ted Howard of Small Business Utility Advocates. I'm curious, seeing it from the perspective of small business, knowing that the challenges, in this case, small utilities, can encounter in meeting safety regulatory requirements. To what extent can there be flexibility in complying with those safety requirements? Are there some safety requirements that could be relaxed while not significantly increasing the risks to employees and customers of that small utility?
So that seems a little bit like a regulatory question in terms of safety rules and procedures, and not really my area of expertise. I think that the thing that's tricky for smaller companies around safety is that they often, as humans, rely on our experience, right? So you could be operating a small utility, not doing it very safely, but not have anything bad happen for a very long period of time and believe you're safe, okay? From my perspective, the focus for a utility should not necessarily be on compliance with a particular rule, but to what extent is that managing that risk, right? Typically, smaller companies rely more heavily on regulations than larger companies because they don't have the expertise to design their own controls, right? So if you're a small company, you can look at what the regulatory requirements are and comply with them, and that will probably get you most of the way because you are, somebody who's got some expertise has designed it. If you're a larger company, you'll probably have the internal staff who might be able to develop a better one. But one of the problems for a small utility company is, do they have the expertise to develop their own adaptation of that requirement? So I think that's a slightly different question. So on a practical level, I have no particular perspective on whether the regulator should reduce the regulatory requirement on small businesses. From a cultural perspective, I think small businesses should think about how their culture is influencing how they manage risk, both in terms of its effectiveness and its efficiency.
Thanks.
Ben Menzies, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Fleming, for the insightful presentation. I wonder if you can speak to if there are any kinds of these inferential indicators that you've mentioned that, sort of in a general sense, obviously it'll depend on the organization and the situation, but that might suggest that companies are inculcating an appropriate safety culture, and whether there are any examples of industries or organizations where we might be able to have some degree of confidence that safety culture exists, understanding that there's it's not an object, like you said, that we can't say here it is, we know what it is. But if we're trying to come up with those inferences or think about what kinds of indicators are more or less valuable, are you able to provide any insight on how you might approach that problem?
Mm-hmm. Great question. So the answer is yes and no. Okay. So a number of years ago, I spent, I think, probably about a decade, it must be nearly between the beginning and the ending, working with a number of Canadian regulators looking at indicators, safety culture indicators. And we did produce a whole set, and there the idea at the time, at the very beginning, was it was something that a inspector might use to give them some insight into where the culture is at. And there were so the basic idea that you're saying is, if you have some knowledge of safety culture, or if you go into an organization, could you tell whether or not they're broadly on the right path or not, right? And the short answer is sort of yes. What happens in practice is it becomes very difficult, right? Because at least in Canada, there's lots of laws about transparency and how audits and inspections are being done. The indicators themselves were released pretty quickly into the public domain, and then when people turn up, then you find that they're all showing you how all these things are true within their organization. So it was a very short timeline between how useful these were and the practice that people were morphing on. So we sort of stepped back a little bit from using the indicators to make a good bad judgment, to be more using them as part of a conversation where the regulator goes in and can talk about, here is where your organization is at, or the organization can use it themselves and say, here are some practices that are associated with a positive safety culture. One that's pretty strong would be the quality of close call near miss reporting, right? So if we go in and we look at that, not just counting the number of close calls and near misses, but actually, are they telling us anything useful, anything meaningful? How is that data being used? That's a really good indicator. And companies with more positive cultures tend to have more detailed close call. So actually just a word count actually is useful, of the number of words that people write when they report near miss, and the extent to which would this information be captured in another format, right? So if I'm reporting about something that no one else saw, that tells you a lot more about the culture than everybody saw it and someone had to write it up, right? So in my mind, yes, there are indicators that are useful. They are most useful for companies to do a self-assessment and for the purpose of improvement, not evaluation. So let's look at what we do. Let's reflect on that and say, oh, we could improve in this area. Why don't we have such good near miss reporting? Let's understand that better. Let's do something to improve. So the short answer is yes, and the other short answer is no.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming. I'm not seeing a lot of different, a lot of other raised hands, but I did have a question for you, Dr. Fleming, and I wonder if you would be able to expand a little bit on um, small organizations generally and their use of contractors and how that generally plays into the safety culture assessment that
Yeah.
are performed.
Yeah. Again, I think this is a more general issue for all companies now, but it's particularly apparent in small companies, is that their capacity to choose contractors and access contractors becomes a real issue. So sometimes we think about the power dynamic as being, I'm paying you, contractor, to do this work. I tell you what to do. But now, because of the shortage and difficulty in accessing contractors, that power dynamic is quite tricky. So often the small companies got relatively little choice of what contractor they use and limited influence over the extent to which they can control the way they act and behave. So again, in that dynamic, one of the themes that would come up is contractor relations. So how do we manage contractors? How do we work with contractors? How do we influence them, right? Just in many different ways. What challenges do we have with that contracting relationship? And then at a cultural level, if they are making up a large proportion of your workforce, then you'd want to get the contractor employee perceptions of how work is managed within your organization. When you're doing your field visits, you'll want to observe contractors in the field doing the work so that you understand how that's operating, and how you interact around safety concerns from different groups. So it's the nature of the relationship. So because they make up often a large proportion of the people who do the safety critical work, you need to include them in that sort of process. In a sort of very natural way of these are the people who are present, these are the people who do the work, and again you're going to be focusing on field observation and document analysis often for that information, and try to talk about it. And I think again, what's important from a company perspective is the purpose of this assessment is to help you understand how risk is present in your business and how you can mitigate it. So understanding your contractors' culture and understanding how you relate to them is going to help you manage that and mitigate those issues. Sometimes where people get hooked up on this or get upset about it is, to what extent am I trying to assess the culture of the contracting company? And for me, I think that's less helpful, is just to say, let's look at how contractors work in our organization. We're not assessing their culture, we're looking at how work is done in our company. Some of that work is done by contractors, some of that work is done by our own employees. And then the question becomes, how do we influence the work that's been done by people in our organization, either contractors or employees? Sometimes it's going to be the same, sometimes it's going to be different. We want to look at that and be open about the challenges we have in terms of risk management, and different contractors we may struggle more with than others. A theme that does come up uniquely for small businesses operating in a safety critical domain, like gas distribution, is competence to do oversight of contractors. So if you're a big company like PG&E, you have loads of engineers. So if there's a technical question, you will have the right answer, right? You will have the capacity to get that information. If you're a small company and you may have one engineer then who may not have expertise in this area, then they have no capacity to do oversight. And that's a risk in your business. And there isn't an easy solution to it, right? So I'm not saying, oh, go out and hire a bunch of engineers. It's just something that you need to think about. How do we go about managing that? How do we think about that? And not just pretend it's not happening, which I think is one of the cultural risks. We try to pretend when something's uncomfortable that it's not happening, and then you're just in denial. It's not so helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming. That is very helpful. Let me just go check on everybody else. Any other questions before we move on to the roundtable? Ben, please jump in.
Sure. You know, I'm still thinking about this tension that you identify between sort of the need for flexibility and an understanding of not being overly prescriptive and thereby creating sort of a checkbox mentality, with also, you know, our role as regulators being to, you know, identify a set of practices or to at least you know, ensure a certain standard of safety culture to some extent. And I wonder if you can speak to any recommendations you might have for thinking about how to make sure that need for flexibility and for understanding unique circumstances of an individual company doesn't become sort of an avenue to excuse practices or behaviors that that could ultimately lead to some sort of hazardous outcome, especially since it seems like, you know, that we really need the buy-in of the companies themselves to see this as a priority, as a first step, and then, you know, to that there's expertise within companies to kind of develop mechanisms and approaches for safety culture assessments that make sense. But if there hasn't been some sort of incident in that industry or in that company, or, you know, it seems like sort of an external thing, you know, creating that sense feels challenging. So can you speak to that tension at all with the flexibility issue?
Great. All the difficult questions, Ben. Thank you. Okay, so this is the inherent dilemma in a lot of what we do, and it is something that is very challenging within a regulatory context, because we have this problem, typical psychological problem. How many psychologists does it take to change a light bulb? Just one, but the light bulb's going to want to change. And the same happens in terms of trying to influence the culture of an organization, be it small or large. They've got to want to improve. Okay, so in my general advice to regulators is, you have oversight and regulatory instruments that are focused on the technical management of risk within the business, and also the outcomes of those things. So that has to be your basic layer of protection around, are these companies managing their safety appropriately? And then I think the safety culture piece requires a different approach, right? So we can do enforcement and require companies to make changes on technical stuff that is quite specific and is a violation of a regulation. And then the culture stuff is more of an influence, an indirect influence. Now, regulators, as has been the case with, let's say, the so-called gas case or other oversight activities, do have an ability to influence, to bring the companies to the process and get them to demonstrate a couple of key things. First of all, to demonstrate that they have done some sort of assessment and they have some insight. So that is a tangible thing where they can say, this is what we did, this is what we found, this is what we learned, right? So those are very tactical things. And then the next thing that you put on them is, well, tell us what you're going to do about it and how you're going to grow and improve, right? Now, those things are different from other regulations because you can't tell them exactly what they should do to fix those things. Even if you know the answer, you can't tell them. You have to sit on your hands and say, let them work it out. And even if they come up with the wrong thing, you need to let them do it, right? Just because that's the process of learning. They have to go through that process, and there's no shortcuts to that. So it's quite frustrating. Depending on the nature of the company and where they're at and how much support they want, you can guide them and maybe give them some feedback on that. One of the things that we generally recommend for a company that's going through any improvement process is that they have some sense of what they're trying to change and how they would know it would change, right? And those things need to be very closely linked or tightly coupled so that you can demonstrate. So a company might say, well, we want to improve the quality of our supervisors. Okay, so we're going to give them some training. Well, what do you expect to change after the training? Not that we just did the training, tick the box, we've done it. What would you expect to change and what would be different? And by asking those questions, you find that A, people don't know what they're doing, and then B, that once they start to realize it, then they change the intervention that they're going to do because training is not actually the problem. They know what they're supposed to do, they just won't do it. What we need is more performance measurement, more performance management. Okay, that's what we're going to do now, and this is what we expect to see change. And that's a difficult process, and it can be quite slow. And from my perspective, particularly for small companies, you start and work on one thing, and then you just work that thing. And as you develop your competence, you get better at doing it and you become more efficient. But it's quite closely linked to leading indicators of safety and a bunch of other things that we would like companies to do anyway. So there is some work that's been done on this. We did put in the record, I think, in a previous discussion, a paper around safety culture indicators. So we're back to the indicators, but in a different format of not using them to make an evaluation, are you good or bad, but more, are you moving in the right direction? So I'm less of a good bad culture kind of person. I'm like, how are you growing and getting better, right? And if you're not getting better, then that's probably a problem. But if you are moving in the right direction and you're doing the technical stuff that we expect you to do, I'm probably less concerned about you. That's probably how I would balance it in my mind. I don't think you can impose a practice on a company because then they will just do it and fake it. But you can help them come to a place where they recognize what they need to change. Pretty long answer to a short question, sorry.
Thanks. And it was a long question, so I appreciate that.
Thank you, Ben and Dr. Fleming, for that insightful discussion. I wonder, before we move on, I don't see any other hands raised, but feel free, everybody, to pose your questions. I wonder, Dr. Fleming, if you would be able to discuss just a little bit more of this concept of influence versus the prescription aspect of it. It sounds like this is something that's potentially both applicable to what contractors do, and also what the regulator role in safety culture, and as one of the guiding recognitions in our goals and principles for the framework. I think it might be helpful to hear from you a little bit on what that really means. What does influence really mean in this circumstance?
Yeah, it's probably trying to sort of say, well, you can't prescribe it. You can't say do this or do that and have this type of culture or have this sort of activity or have this kind of achievement or outcome. So in that case, which is more typical for regulations, have a management program for this, do these number of inspections. So in culture, what you can create is a framework like you have to say, this is what culture is, and this is what you need to do. Here are some approaches to doing it, and here is what improvement looks like. Here are some of the features about how a company will be going around an improvement. And by then expecting companies to go through that process and guiding them through it and maybe asking them questions about it, you influence their approach. And it is tricky because it's much more apparent that you are not controlling the outcome, right? You are working through the company and you have your impact is very much indirect. And it's in what for a company to have ownership, it means the regulator does not have ownership, right? So that sort of distance, I think, is going to be really important. And They need to be able to sort of own the process, own how they're going to improve. And your role can be to hold them to account, for want of a better word, of are they really genuinely engaging in the process? Is there evidence that they're putting effort in, and is there evidence of their improvement? And probably judging less the specific things that they're doing, right? I think that's the thing where regulators can get trapped, is that they see a best practice in another industry or another company and say, you should do this practice because good companies do this practice. And then you get the company to do that practice, but it doesn't help because actually the culture doesn't support it. They never engage in it. They're only doing it to keep you happy. And again, if I go back to the love metaphor, if you were trying to, reduce the number of divorces in society, you might come up with a set of rules and practices that should be implemented for all couples. Well, actually, that probably wouldn't work, right? You might have people faking that this is what they're doing because they're afraid of getting into trouble with the marriage regulator, but they wouldn't actually really believe it, and it wouldn't work in practice. So I think there is a need for the regulator to recognize the limits of their influence, right? So that, I know it's a tired thing, I keep saying it, but the light bulb has got to want to change. And it doesn't matter how much you want it for them. There are limits to what you can do in this space. That doesn't mean you don't have influence over their safety outcomes and how they manage safely. And if they don't have the capacity to manage and if they're not improving, then you can use other regulatory measures to influence their practice. But in the cultural domain, because of its abstract nature, you need to be step back and focus on the process rather than the specific activities. Because if you start to tell them what to do, it will just lose its meaningfulness.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming. Those are both a lot to think about and certainly a big challenge. And so thank you, Ben, for posing those questions. I think there's a lot to think about. Obviously, in the small utility context, there's a lot that we do have to consider. And I think this is where we'll move on to our roundtable and want to give the opportunity to the utilities to also voice your opinions and your thoughts around safety culture assessments and your practices and the value derive, and also to use this opportunity to ask your questions from Dr. Fleming or the Commission or from each other to help inform the process as we move forward. So I will share my screen again. Just one last check. Any last minute questions before I move on? Okay. All right, moving on. Let me share my screen, everybody. Okay. All right, so we are right on time. Okay, so the roundtable panel today consists of the small utility representatives and our subject matter expert, Dr. Fleming. 9 out of the 10 small utilities are represented today, so I'm counting that all of you who mentioned you would be attending are here. I haven't done a checklist of all of you, but we are just missing Southwest Gas. In terms of speaking format, we'll start with the small utilities. And so please raise your hand as you're ready to speak and I'll call on you. However, if no volunteers to speak first come up, we'll call on each utility kind of in the order that you see on the slide. When speaking, please state your name, role, and the utility that you represent. And if we finish earlier than expected, we can use the time to answer any remaining questions from the workshop participants as well. But we'll see how things are going.
Carolina, this is Jen Garlock. I just wanted to jump in. It looks like Central Valley Gas Storage is not listed there. And we do have 2 representatives on the line for Central Valley Gas Storage.
Oh, you're right. 1, 2, 3. Yes, there's supposed to be 9 utilities here. So my apologies, and I will correct that. So thank you for noting it. That is my mistake. Appreciate that. So Central Valley CVGS is with us. Southwest Gas is not. So everybody else is, just clarifying. So the objective of the roundtable is to understand how the characteristics of the small utilities might affect the applicability of the large utility framework we presented on earlier today. I realized there was a lot of information probably to digest from SPD's presentation earlier, which is why we wanted to share a lot of that information ahead of time. And so hopefully today's presentation sort of cemented some of the ideas, and also Dr. Fleming's presentation on some of the considerations to keep in mind might help. So let's start with our first question. And, generally high hazard organizations perform safety culture assessments to proactively identify some strengths and vulnerabilities in the shared attitudes, norms, beliefs, and behaviors that influence safety, to improve them vulnerabilities and in an attempt to prevent future incidents. But of course, as we heard from Dr. Fleming, there's a lot more at play here than just saying we're going to prevent accidents from doing safety culture assessments. And so for our first question, what do you see is the value of utility safety culture assessments, and how might that value be different for small utilities compared to large organizations? We had asked you to please discuss what factors contribute to those differences. And there's an additional item I want you to keep in mind when providing your input, and is to include the safety risk profiles of your organizations in those considerations, and what your type of operations, what type of safety risk do they present, and how can those relate to the value you derive from safety culture assessments. So with that, I am going to allow small utilities, please raise your hands if you want. Otherwise, I'll start going down the list on your to call on your representatives. Okay, so let's start with Bear Valley. I believe Mr. Marconi, you are one of the representatives on there, so please go ahead to jump in and share your insights.
Well, obviously the challenges are, as the doctor mentioned, small company. I think one of the key takeaways for me, and I've always found this to be the most enlightening and most challenging, is getting employees to report when things are wrong or near misses, and take those opportunities to learn so they don't become big issues later on. That's always, I think, and I think that's a good measure of safety culture. If we're looking for a measure, really, what is the assessment of the culture there? And I think when employees feel that they can, report things that no one else saw, that we can all learn from, that's useful. So and I don't know how it's hard to, I think the quality of the near miss is often, because I get a lot of little minor near misses, but there are things that happen out in the field that probably were pretty significant, but no one thought to call it a near miss. Maybe rigging is, for example, is probably a one that probably happens more often than people realize. So anyways, those are some of the key things. So I think an assessment, when people come, when we do assessments on small organizations, maybe because the numbers are not statistically relevant and we have small numbers, maybe focusing on, hey, how comfortable are employees about reporting issues, and are the issues have substance to them?
Thanks for sharing, Mr. Marconi. I think that's it's helpful to understand some of what you see internally as some of the challenges for you. I'm curious in terms of the value that I understand, Bear Valley goes through assessments annually, and I'm curious if you would speak to how assessments and what value you see internally with these assessments for Bear Valley.
Well, we had been doing these annual OEIS assessments, which consist of surveys and some document reviews, and quite frankly, the annual assessments were really not sustainable. Because number one, I think the regulator had a hard time executing those, and two, by the time we had even gotten corrective action and started to work on corrective action, we were doing another survey. So in fact, I think in one cycle, the report from the previous came out a month before the next survey was given, which really didn't give us much time to digest what had happened. I think OEIS now has gone to a 2-year interval with SB 254, which, but I think the 4-year that the CPUC is considering is probably more realistic. Because it gives you time to digest and implement, changes that need to happen, and then assess if what you've done to implement those changes is working.
Thanks for sharing, Mr. Marconi. I think that I will give an opportunity for Liberty and Pacific Corps to jump in and share any thoughts on the value of assessments for you, especially when you consider the risk of your organizations and type of operations. And I've added the question to the chat as I've taken the slide off of the screen. So either Liberty or Pacific Corps, please feel free to jump in.
Carolina, we have a hand up.
I do not see who that is. Oh, Mr. Hall, go ahead. Thanks, Oge.
Yep. Hi, everybody. My name is Daryl Hall. I'm the Chief Operations Officer for Central Valley Gas Storage. I think, we all feel the pains that Mr. Marconi is speaking about, but I think to keep, the buy-in from all employees and contractors and vendors, whether you're a small company or a large company, to keep that from not being a cliche, is something that you just have to live. And from day one, when people come into your facility to do work or to work there, if the culture is there and the rules are there and everybody's doing what they're supposed to be doing, I don't see that there's a big difference between large companies or small companies. We should all be developing the same culture across the industry to keep everybody safe and be able to go home.
Thank you for those thoughts. Is there any else from Mr. Stolman from Liberty? Please go ahead.
Yeah, Peter Stoltman. I'm Senior Manager of Wildfire Prevention at Liberty. And I guess first off, just thanks for the opportunity for us to have the discussion. Just thinking about looking at, the differences between the smaller utilities and the large ones. One thing that stands out to me really is just the organizational structure and, having a smaller team. For us, when there's a near miss or an accident or something that happens, usually within 24 hours, everybody in the organization is aware of it. It's happening the next morning. There's a safety stand down company wide. We're all talking about it. And there are much fewer layers of organizational structure to get that message from the top down. Whereas we're having, I mean, just as an example here, with Paul from Bear Valley, president of the company, engaged in these conversations at this level, and myself reporting to the president of the company. I feel like it's what maybe more quick ability to adapt more quickly because of our size gives us an advantage. And I think related to that is that there's a opportunity to adapt or influence culture more quickly, and having, I guess, one good person, right? One person can really make a difference throughout the entire organization when we have these small companies. So when you see, the senior level management in those safety meetings on a day-to-day basis, that really does trickle down to the individual contributors as well. So I think in that respect, it gives us an advantage to have a positive influence on safety culture and not having to take so long potentially to right the ship when there is a near miss or something that happens because of our size. I think that conversely, the challenge to that is that when we're asked to maybe stand up a new committee or an organization or something to address safety culture, it's the same people that are in those meetings every day at the same time already. So it doesn't really make a big impact or a difference for us, other than, okay, now we have to have a new group that has meetings and resources that may be taking away from other work. So it adds an additional constraint to time when we may already be achieving the objective through other means. Whereas those larger companies may need to have more working groups or subgroups to address those issues, whereas we kind of can do it on our through our normal course of business operations.
Thank you, Mr. Stallman. That's a very interesting point, and just kind of reflecting on what you mentioned, it's really this proximity of smaller of leadership and small organizations to the front lines that seems like it gives you potentially an advantage in knowing what is happening as opposed to a larger organization. And it seems that maybe that's something that is a consideration in assessment. And perhaps this is, I might ask Dr. Fleming, and sorry to call out on you out of order, but I was curious if there's anything about this point that Mr. Stallman brought up that influences how assessments are conducted, or the value of an assessment for a small organization.
Yeah, so that is a key benefit that small utilities and small organizations have. Communication tends to be less of an issue because it's a smaller group of people, and also the assessment itself is typically easier because it's a smaller group of people, right? So it's not, the 1 year process that doing the so-called gas assessment took, right? It's not as complex. So those things are true. And I think the thing again is to say that rather than trying to judge your culture as good or bad, try to understand how the culture of your organization influences risk in one shape or form. So the close, tight-knit group that you tend to have with a small company has the strength of quick communication, and a shared understanding develops pretty quickly. But then that also can create some blind spots for you, where that shared understanding, that interpersonal relationships become something you rely on, and that can bring risk into the business. So it's not to say it's good or bad, it's just to say that sometimes that the culture that you have and has evolved over a period of time can both reduce risk and help you manage risk in ways that maybe other companies can't do, but also can bring in risk or increase the likelihood that something bad will happen, but in a slightly different way. So relying on one individual as being the expert for something often happens in a small company. something happens in that person's personal life, or they become ill, or they leave the organization, and suddenly that brings in a whole pile of other risk, right? So it's just thinking about those things. But definitely, I would agree that some aspects, particularly communication and the ability of leaders to communicate clearly with staff about priorities, happens within much better in a small organization. Having said that, if you have a leader in your organization who is either not good at communicating that commitment, or for some reason doesn't particularly think safety is important, then they could do a lot more damage as well. So it's sort of double-edged sword.
Yeah, I was going to add, in the small organization, some strong personalities may have a negative effect. In other words, they stamp out everybody else's opinions or points of view.
Yeah, and also within small organizations, people often have a long history. So it's not unusual in a small organization someone to be there 10, 20 years, and they've worked with this person, they may have gone to school with this person. They may be, as in some cases in organizations I work with, married to that another colleague's wife, right? You know, who's divorced, and that causes some complexity in terms of those interpersonal relationships and managing those issues, people who've had maybe a particularly strong opinion or have been deferred to for a number of years. So there are definitely some strengths in small organizations, but also some real challenges in managing those interpersonal issues that occur. And where we tend to be sometimes weaker is in directly addressing that issue, where a individual has a particularly strong opinion, and they're going to be with your organization. Probably you're not going to fire them because of the skills that they bring, but they do need to be coached as to, well, how is that unhelpful, particularly if they're a more senior person and more junior people look up to them and will take on faith whatever they're saying. So that is a more complex issue that comes up in smaller organizations. A bigger company would just fire that person and move on. That's not a luxury often small companies have, so they have to work with that person whether they like it or not.
So somewhat of a takeaway is the magnification of interpersonal relationships that small organizations have to deal with, and that seems to have a positive and a negative potentially for culture. So we have Megan Sumoji. I think you had your hand raised first, so I'm going to make sure I come over to you.
Yes, thank you, Megan Sumoji for Wild Goose Storage and Lodi Gas Storage. I think we certainly agree in the majority of sort of the observations so far. I think that safety itself is just as important for the small utilities as it is for the large ones. But the question of what a safety culture assessment might look like for the smaller entities, it really needs to be considered through the lens of the size of the individual utility and sort of their operational characteristics and capabilities. We heard earlier, right, from a mathematical standpoint, the small volumes of survey responses, the smaller pool of available documents and data. Statistically, that might be insignificant, but we're talking about real life on the ground operations on a day-to-day basis within an organization. And from that standpoint, I think we believe that the feedback that we get from our employees and our contractors, the annual assessments that management does, the internal change orders and improvement plans, again, statistically might not be significant, but for the organization is actually very important. And so we would not want to end up with a framework that discounted just the realities of who we are and what we have available to us. I think we would agree that there are some real benefits to having a smaller, more nimble organization where everybody is much more transparent to each other also recognize that there can be some challenges to that, but I think we would also recommend looking at how the interaction of the parent company in the administration of the safety culture assessment and sort of just the safety culture best practices factors into that as well, because we saw on the slide earlier a number of the entities here, including Wildgoose and Lodi, have safety culture processes that are administered at the parent company level, and that will be a really relevant dynamic into what is happening both, in the fields with the utility staff and sort of at an organizational level. Carolina, you also asked for, if we could discuss sort of the safety profiles, the risk profiles of the individual entities. For Wildgoose and Lodi in our May filing, we did provide a significant amount of information about the Sterling safety records and, all of the processes that the entities go through. We'll also note that because Rockpoint is a Canadian company, Wildgoose and Lodi, as well as Rockpoint, are subject to some of the Canadian frameworks that were discussed earlier. And while we also recognize that, as was discussed earlier, that just the lack of incidents is not in and of itself an indicator of, the type of safety culture. We do still believe that you can work backwards and look upstream, look at the safety record in the context of what are the safety practices, what are the organization's views on training, and how does management look at what are the safety requirements in terms of being out in the field, how are incident reporting processes set up. And I do believe that you can sort of reverse engineer at least some aspect of an organization's safety culture from the fact that they are safe on a day-to-day basis out in the field and are checking in with their contractors and are checking in with their employees. And so, we would want that to remain part of the analysis as we are thinking about what needs to be done. And then I think this is probably more an issue for question 2 when we get there, but we do also have some real concerns about just sort of the scalability, the feasibility from a financial and logistical standpoint of kind of trying to superimpose the framework that has been adopted for the big utilities onto this group here. But I will just put a pin in that for when we get there.
Thank you for sharing those insights, Megan. When you were discussing the safety risk profile, I think, would you be able to elaborate a little bit more about what makes, and I don't mean Lodi and Wildgoose specifically, but I mean the types of operations that gas storage operators manage, and how, in your view, those are different from, let's say, the other utilities that are in this phase 2, the other small utilities, and of course the large utilities. So I think it would be helpful to understand a little bit about that uniqueness, not so much how you're mitigating that risk, which is perhaps what you were referring to about the, your certificates and the types of processes you have in place, which, I'd mentioned that with our approach, those aren't really the bulk of culture, but from the perspective of the types of operations, how do those differ, and what kind of risk do they really present, and how that may be different or not to the other small utilities here?
Sure, I can start off, but I am a lawyer, not a gas storage engineer, so I may also defer to Rockpoint's folks who are here on the call as well. I think, if we're talking from just an operational standpoint, what is the sort of, what are the safety considerations and requirements just from being in the gas storage business. I mean, you know, it's a very high pressure physically. That is not a risk or an operational characteristic that, you know, that's really no different necessarily from Wild Goose and Lodi to Central Valley to Gill Ranch to the big utilities with their gas facilities. But we all have, our storage facilities are all different. They are different sizes, different numbers of wells, different withdrawal and injection capabilities, and all of those characteristics do influence the way you need to pressurize things, what the equipment is and where it is. And so from a, you know, facility by facility standpoint, your day-to-day on the ground operations will not necessarily look the same. But I think sort of writ larger, I think there is less difference, right? We have to make sure that, you know, all the pressurized equipment is functioning as intended, that all personnel who are on site understand what they're doing, what the safety risks are, have had the training. So it, you know, from that standpoint, I'm not certain that there are huge differences depending on the size of the utility, right? We're all trying to operate safely, very highly pressurized and potentially dangerous facilities, but what the organization looks like that is doing that work, that's really where the difference comes in. I think I'm going to stop talking now and see if Harold Gold or Greg Clark have any other input. And I would also really be interested in hearing from Central Valley and Gill Ranch as well, if they have thoughts on that.
Do we know if they're on the call, Megan?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Sure. So, hi, my name's Greg Clark with Rock Point Gas Storage. And to Megan's point, I think primarily this is an issue of scalability. So for an operator like Lodi Gas Storage or Wild Goose Storage, we might own and operate, for example, like 45 miles of natural gas transmission pipeline. And I can't speak to PG&E or Sempra. I'm imagining it's several thousand miles of natural gas transmission pipeline. So we might have 2 mechanics or 9 operators, and they've got, I don't know, you probably have a better idea than I do, the CPUC folks on this call, hundreds to thousands of employees. So from a scalability issue, you know, what works for them might not be as effective for a small utility like Rock Point or CVGS or Gill Ranch.
And I just want to make sure, Greg, when you say might not work for, you're referring to a safety culture assessment. Is that right? Or are you referring to something else?
I'm talking about, so yes, I think as we've already addressed, I think there is lots of value in the safety culture assessment process, but I think the exact tools that would be employed to bring that about might not scale or be as flexible for a small operator like a Rock Point. So the exact same methods might not work for us. I don't think it's a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. And I think we heard a little bit on this from, I mean, I think quite a bit from Dr. Fleming. It sounds like on options and ways we could consider what a small utilities assessment. But I realize, and I just want to also acknowledge Megan's point of the parent company's involvement in this process. And, you know, as you saw, there was a wide range of the type of involvement that the parent companies have. So, and also, I would also acknowledge that how they're structured in terms of how involved management and leaders are in the specific subsidiary, or it sounds like some are even on site that are direct employees of the parent company. So some of that complexity sounds like might be magnified by the size of a small utility. But I wonder, just going to ask Dr. Fleming if you wouldn't mind just sort of giving us a brief recap of how could assessments potentially be modified in your view to kind of fit this scalability issue. And by scalability, I mean scaling down, as Greg pointed out, and not up. So the opposite.
Yeah. So I think in general, it's helpful for companies to, customize any assessment to their needs, right? So I think we need to step back and look at this from a different perspective, not say, the to sort of prescribe something, but say, well, what are the needs of the organization? How are they going to gain insight into their culture, and what's going to give them the most insight? So I think maybe Greg was talking about quite a small number of employees. It looks like maybe we'll just give, for example, may not be your organization. Maybe you've only got 25 employees. Okay. Well, in that context, if you're going to do an assessment, you're going to start to focus more on maybe getting someone to come and do an observation and look at your documents and have a conversation about how you're going about managing risk and the relationship with people. You might do some, as part of those observations, you might do some interviews with people who you see, okay? And you might talk about how you manage contractors. In terms of the scope or size of that assessment, it's going to be in days rather than weeks, right? So you're probably going to have someone with some knowledge who's going to be on site for maybe a day or two, and then collecting some information and providing some feedback. And the reason why it's so much smaller and the relative value is going to be smaller is because the organization complexity is lower, right? Now, that doesn't mean that they're not going to gain some insight into how they're going about managing risk and getting some feedback as part of that sort of process. And in some ways, the thing that gets a little bit trickier in this space is that it can seem a bit like a safety audit, but it's actually coming from quite a different place, right? It's looking at things from a totally different angle. So audits tend to be compliance-based. This might look the same in the sense you've got someone who's turning up, talking to staff, looking at how work has been done, looking at documents. It's just they're looking at it from a different angle, right? So if you're doing an audit, you're looking at, did the documents comply with what the standard is? If you're looking at a site visit, you're seeing, is that standard being complied with? In a safety culture assessment, you're trying to understand, well, why do we have those documents? How are you using those documents? How do people perceive them to be useful? What are the challenges they're experiencing on a work site? What's their perception of what's going on, right? So why am I saying this is sometimes what I describe to people for a small utility or small business makes them think like, oh, it's just a safety audit, right? We're just getting someone in to do a safety audit. And it can look quite similar, but actually it's quite different because of what we're trying to achieve and how we're trying to look at things. From what I've heard so far, one of the challenges I think small utilities are going to have is getting some expertise in a general sense around safety culture. They don't need to become safety culture experts, but to be able to understand how it's different from other parts of their business and how it influences risk, and have that spread across their business. Some education on that level probably would be the thing that would be most helpful at this stage, I think, for smaller businesses, because if they look at, say, a safety culture assessment report from so-called GAS, the one that's online from CPUC, and they think and they read it and they'll fall off their chair. I mean, it's just not relevant. It's just not. We might call it the same thing, but it's going to look so different, right? We're trying to get to the same spot of understanding the why. What are the drivers of your safety? What are the things that are creating risk in your business? What are the things you maybe can't see that you should be able to see? What are your blind spots? Those sorts of things. We're using similar methods, but on the scale that is much, much smaller. And it's much, much more about having a conversation with people and trying to get them to gain some insight rather than a more complex assessment. So for me, The objective remains the same: enabling the company to gain insight into how their culture influences risk. And that process will be different, although we're likely to draw on similar methods, with the exception of the only method that you're using, which is surveys. If I was going to drop a method off it, it would probably be surveys, because for small companies, it's not a meaningful piece of information to collect. Yet from the information that Carolina shared with us earlier, it seems to be the only one that people are using. So of the ones that you're using, it's the one that I wouldn't use. And I would focus on it being, what insight am I gaining? I would start small and simple and build over time. I would focus on education of all the staff within the company, would probably be the first step I would do. This, the managers need to understand this concept, why it's important, why it's different from other things. Sorry.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming. And I will acknowledge, Megan, that it sounds that for your organizations, given the structure you have and the involvement of your parent company, that you find value in the survey for the parent company's involvement primarily. And I am assuming that this type of survey is the same survey that's distributed probably across subsidiaries or other storage operators to get a bigger picture profile of the subsidiaries. Is that more or less how the survey is used?
I will turn it over to, I think, to either Harold or Greg for specific discussion, because they're our subject matter experts. But my understanding is that while Rockpoint does administer the safety culture assessment process for all of its gas storage entities, it is a very focused inquiry from entity to entity, so it's not sort of a kind of a diffuse information gathering. But Greg, Harold, please elaborate.
Hi, it's Harold Gold here, a manager of safety for Rockpoint. I'm just using Greg's computer at the moment. But just to elaborate more on that, we do that safety culture perception survey annually. We review the results at a high level. We bring in and do interviews with all the department heads and review the data. And then we filter it again down to the individual workers at their level as well, so they get an understanding of how the surveys change year to year, the trending, and what we're doing internally to continually improve our performance and our scores on those. Within Rockpoint, we have a 1 to 5 scale, and we're typically around that 4.6, 4.7 mark. So we don't have a whole lot of room for improvement, but we're always striving to get it closer and closer to that 5.
Thanks, Greg. And I think this might be something that, given that the small utilities didn't participate in the first phase of the proceeding, or at least did not engage as actively as the large utilities did, of what we've learned in terms of, hitting a ceiling with your surveys, and being one of the challenges with relying on surveys for your cultural perceptions. And in my understanding, and I'll let Dr. Fleming elaborate, but my understanding is the safety culture survey perception might have some more utility in terms of you get learning something. And I guess the point here again being insights and learning. If you're able to get something useful out of it, and usually the survey might be if you have something that is negative that comes out of it, because as surveys go, you will, if you have very positive outcomes, it's not necessarily telling you that you just have a positive culture, but you're just not gathering insights that can be useful for you to improve. But I'm probably butchering this up a fair amount, so I might ask Dr. Fleming to kind of share some of those insights about the ceiling effect of surveys that might decrease their utility. because of precisely what you pointed out, Harold.
Yeah. So a couple of things here is to say, so first of all, I've been doing this quite a long time, and I started in the offshore oil and gas industry in the 90s. And we developed a lot of the perception surveys back then that have been adapted and used in different parts of the world. And then towards the end of the 90s, developed the safety culture maturity model that placed organizations from pathological to generative, and the idea to help people along that journey. And as time has gone on, really the focus from the beginning to today is to help organizations improve. And the surveys were helpful maybe at the beginning to help organizations improve because the employees had relatively negative perceptions. So there was something for us to work on and something for us to help them improve with, because we were able to identify issues and help the organization understand that and help things improve. As time has gone on, we found that particularly in pipeline companies, the perceptions tend to start quite positively, particularly in smaller companies and particularly in rural companies. And I think this has got a lot to do with the extent to which people like their jobs and their perception of the company and maybe relative perceptions of safety. But what we find is that those perception survey results become less helpful and actually could be give us the opposite sense of how safe we are, and maybe a warning sign rather than a good sign. So I would never recommend to a company where their employees had pretty positive perceptions that they should try to make them more positive. I think that's unhelpful. I think that's increasing risk, not decreasing risk. So I think that's the wrong target you've been set for yourselves. And it goes into this general mindset of we're measuring an objective thing, which is called culture, and we measure that objective thing through employee perceptions. Employee perceptions are a part of the picture, but the question is why they perceive them that way. And companies are much more interested in asking the question why employees perceive have negative perceptions. But when employees have positive perceptions, there's less interest in asking the question why they have positive perceptions. It's because we're good at safety. And actually, that's rarely the case, right? So asking the question why people think you're so safe becomes, I think, an important question. A question that I often get companies to look at is they often will have items which are around close call or near miss reporting. And you'll often see on where employees' perceptions are very positive, where they have very positive perceptions of those things, near miss reporting, close call reporting. But then we go and look at the data surrounding near miss and close call reporting, and nobody's doing it. Right. So we have this one thing where employers are saying, oh, we've got great near miss reporting and we're very good at near miss reporting. But then we go and look at the data and we find, oh, it's not actually that good at all. It's not very good quality reports. We get maybe lots of them or we don't get any, but yet people are saying they've got them. And then that's a really interesting discussion to have about why do people think we're doing a really good job in this area when in fact we're not, and what that's about. So I think there's a much more asking questions rather than making judgments about how good or bad we are. So that sort of good-bad judgment is broadly unhelpful. So for me, perception surveys are a part of a picture, but all of them need to be interpreted. And high levels of agreement with positively worded items may or may not tell you something. What they tell you, it's not as apparent as it would be on the level. I have to give a disclaimer, I suppose, although clearly I believe I'm right. I wouldn't be giving you this perspective, and I have been doing it a long time, so I feel I have some evidence to support me. But most providers in North America only do surveys, and they rate companies on a scale of 1 to 5 and say higher towards 5 mean you're good to go, you're top in class, don't worry about anything. And I'll give you a couple of cautionary notes on that. BP, before they had Deepwater Horizon, had completed a survey of the perceptions of people on that asset and on shore as well. And they were in the top quartile of BP. Okay. And then within a month, they had an explosion that was primarily due to cultural factors. So just because people have positive perceptions should be no source of comfort. People got negative perceptions, that should be a cause of concern, but positive perceptions shouldn't be a cause of comfort. And there is other studies that have been done that have looked at entities that have had major events. And again, positive perceptions are not a protection against having a major failure. So it's useful to do it, but I would recommend for this group to focus more on a more qualitative approach, which is focused on document review, observation, and some interviews with employees. But the bulk of it is on what we do, how we do it, what are the challenges we experience, how do we resolve those challenges, what are the outcomes of our management system, looking at some of those indicators like near miss, close call reporting, safety reporting, resolving safety issues, how we deal with non-compliance with rules and procedures. All of those things are telling you a lot more about your culture than necessarily a perception survey, particularly if you've got small numbers of employees.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming. And I do want to just recognize that, Megan, you mentioned that for Rockpoint, it was valuable to have feedback from employees. And I guess what I would say is, I don't think you should, or anyone should substitute an assessment for that feedback, right? It seems that that's part of your growing or your culture and obtaining, closing that loop of feedback and also acting on that feedback as part of, as well as how you strengthen your culture as well. So, just want to clarify that I don't think we would suggest not gathering feedback from your employees at all. Mr. Cisna, you have your hand up, so please go ahead and
yeah,
there you go. Oh, you're on mute. We heard you the first time.
I unmuted and so Joe Cisna, corporate health and safety manager at Pacific Corp. I'm 30-year safety professional in the electric utility. The question that you had, just going back to it, although this discussion I could just kind of build on it, but was what was the value, and how is it different for small utilities? So really glad to hear the California-based smaller utilities go first. Pacific Corp's a little bit unique, of course, just because it's a large 6-state utility with a very small presence in California, Northern California. I will say that the issues that small utilities have might be, I don't know, Dr. Fleming, how you agree with it, but could also hold true for the subgroups of larger utilities. So like for us, when we go into a subgroup to explore using safety culture assessment work, we could still encounter similar issues that you might see in smaller utilities. Also, there was this mention of everybody knowing each other. Pacific Corp is a largely rurally situated utility, and for sure in our smaller groups we have folks who know each other, and everybody knows each other in the community pretty well, which can factor in, of course, to already mentioned implications to the survey work and such. But so sample size issues, anonymity issues can affect us as smaller groups. But overall, just in terms of the value, for us, I guess one way we look at the safety culture work is that it represents employee engagement. I use that term just because it's used in safety management systems and brought out as a primary factor for a safety program, high functioning safety programs. And when we look at our assessment work, we look at it as it's not only a measurement of how our engagement's working to some extent, it's also engagement itself. It's a moment of high engagement when we're systematically asking questions. So it certainly is good. It's not the only thing that we do. One of the things that I heard already in this workshop was references to regulations and compliance, which can help us distinguish the values of these safety culture assessments. But I think that's a little bit simplistic, given that we know that in mature safety programs, compliance and regulatory drivers really represent a very small percentage of the drivers that for what we're doing. When we're, for instance, trying to increase our near miss reporting and follow-up, you won't see a regulatory driver for that. That's just us knowing what good looks like and working towards it. And the same thing with a lot of our hazard recognition work. We're currently working on SIF prevention, serious injury and fatality prevention, trying to apply even more specific measures to recognize those precursors and monitor our workplace for the presence of those types of factors for big events. And you won't see that in regulatory drivers. So just making that one mention is that I see the purpose of distinguishing between compliance and safety culture work, but there's something in between there just to call out. Yeah. The other thing about the assessments, I just wrote a note or two, and then I'm move on to the next question for you. And again, thanks for the chance to participate in this process. But when we get our assessments back, I won't, insight was the term used, and I can't agree more. We get insights, but I wouldn't call them novel insights, right? I mean, when we do a culture effort, a survey company-wide as well, and the 3 takeaways we get from those: improve our near-miss reporting, improve our follow-up. Those are already mentioned by Dr. Fleming as kind of some typical ones. Also, improve our policies and procedures. Those are the top 3. Well, none of those were, aha moments for us, but they sure are. It sure is helpful to hear that directly from our workforce and our managers. So it's very validating, and that's one of the things that, as a safety professional, I appreciated about the assessment work. One thing, maybe jumping ahead, was but I've been exposed to safety culture consultants out of Marin County. Their work, it's consulting firm, Steve Simon, and also the HSC. We currently use the Health and Safety Executive Safety Climate Survey out of the UK. And one thing I noticed is that in the simplicity of a form, we also look for comments. We actually just in the form put room for comments. And in addition to the numerics that we get out of this, the comment quality, I think it was Ted, I'm sorry, got the name wrong, but just talking about the quality of near-miss reporting as opposed to the quantity. Well, that comment quality that we get from our culture assessment results ends up producing a lot of benefits for us. A lot of insights come from just very candid, sometimes very funny comments from our employees that really shed a lot of light on our safety programs. I don't know if that's maybe a solution for the small utilities if the option is to maybe reshape the assessments so they're not just multiple choice numeric, but also allow for some comment space. Thank you. That's it for me. Unless you have
Thank you,
questions.
Gerald. That was very helpful to hear from you and some of your practices. And I think it sounds to me that what you're referring to is with the comment section, potentially, leading towards more that qualitative side of the insights that you get rather than relying on this numerical side, and where you might find more insights could be in that qualitative side. And I think that it aligns in terms of obtaining more qualitative insights with what we've been hearing from Dr. Fleming, potentially increasing some of these other insight means of gathering insight so that you can get more substantive insights into your culture. I do want to recognize that there's a lot that we could probably dig into in terms of the assessments, but and I think you are yourself getting into the second question, which I want to make sure we give it enough time. But I do want to make sure that I check in on the gas utilities, and we have West Coast Gas. We do not have we do not have Southwest Gas, but I want to make sure I check in on the gas utilities before moving on to our second question on the value of assessments, what they see the value of assessments as. And I don't know if we have all those representatives on the line.
This is Cindy with West Coast Gas.
Hi, Cindy. There you are.
Hi. We are a very small utility company, and assessments, we've had a very hard time in establishing or knowing exactly what questions to ask or what to look for, because all of our employees do communicate with each other on a daily basis, and if problems arise or if there's an incident, it's always discussed, and a way to move forward is already established within that. And then to do another assessment on it, it's sort of hard to tell exactly what we are trying to find and what we are trying to improve upon. And it sort of seems that we are improving as we go, and so it's sort of hard to quantify it or acknowledge it or put it into an assessment of any sort. And that is where we get hung up on an assessment.
And for context, I just want to mention West Coast Gas, you have reported, I think 9 employees, is that correct?
Well, actually, we only have 7.
7. Yeah. Oh, yes, correct. 7, West Coast Gas, and then Alpine. So thank you. I appreciate for those insights. And Alpine, I believe, hands raised. So please, Patrick, go ahead.
Sure, and thanks for the opportunity. So I think we echo a lot of the other views and concerns, and really value the communication in 360 degrees within the company on the topic of safety and safety culture. So, and just for context, Alpine is a gas distributor exclusively, very small company in Calaveras County, and has 7 employees. So there are 2 executive level employees, 2 qualified pipeline operators, and then 3 customer service representatives. So we can handle safety culture issues in a pretty organic way. And so I guess my comments are that, that communication is very valuable, but it also happens in a more efficient way given our size than perhaps a larger company with multiple departments and a need to be more formalistic about things. So I guess we would just ask that, and I may be getting to your other questions here too, but just ask that there be flexibility in the assessments and some consideration of kind of a company that's structured like this with so few employees, and our ability to kind of handle things in a more organic manner. And so I think just a more open-ended set of assessments that we can populate as we see fit according to our specific dynamics would be best. So I'll stop there and see if you have questions for us, but wanted to make sure that I put in context how small and yet focused on safety we are.
Yeah, no, thank you, Patrick. I mean, I think both for yourself, for your organization, and for West Coast Gas, that's we're talking about under 10 employees, which is obviously a very, very small organization. And that does take us to the second question, and I'll post it in the chat in just a minute. And I'd be curious to hear from Dr. Fleming, and I'm going to put you on the spot if that's okay again. It's just, is there potentially a threshold under which some of these, 10, an organization of 10, can they actually learn something, gain insights, even if it's just, a couple of interviews with staff, conversations, a few side observations, or is there a threshold under do all organizations, respective of size, can gain some level of understanding, or is there ability to kind of tranche sizes, or is there another variable that we should be looking at in terms of this flexibility for small organizations?
Yeah, thanks, Carolina. So I would say the value of assessments gets lower the smaller your organization is. So there is a trade-off, and I think the questions are different. So and I would start maybe from the perspective of we have as a small organization a requirement to manage hazards. Okay, so the conversation starts really about from a hazard management perspective, and what are the challenges that we may be experienced with that? What are the challenges with the nature of our company being small that we may experience, and what are the strengths? And can we learn something by looking at safety from a different perspective? So the real benefit of safety culture as an approach is it looks at safety from the less tangible aspects, the more interpersonal aspects, and the how things get done and why things don't get done. And in that, it's not about making a judgment for, doesn't matter how big your company is in my mind, whether you've got a good or a bad culture. It's about understanding how the way we work impacts how we do our work, and where might the threats be, and what might we want to do differently in that conversation. So when you're a small company, I think it's still worthwhile asking that question and thinking about, well, what are the challenges we experience in terms of managing hazards as a small company, and how might we do things differently, and what might we think about it from that sort of perspective, rather than focusing maybe on documentation and compliance and those sorts of things. What are the things that might also be important in terms of that conversation? An assessment in that context is going to look very different, and it's going to be much more about some sort of reflection. It may only involve one or two people in that sort of process. It may involve everybody. It depends on how you run your company and how you want to improve things. It's definitely going to be a very short activity. And from my perspective, it's not going to include a survey. And your output of that assessment is a description of what we did. Here's the topics we talked about, possibly. Here's the documentation we looked at, and here's the insight we gained. So it's going to be a much smaller process. And again, the utility of that activity is probably going to be less than, say, for a company of 50 people, right? Just because a lot of that conversation, a lot of what you're documenting is stuff you probably already know, although it can be helpful to go through that written process. So the only thing I would say is that I don't like the idea of just saying, well, if you're below 10, you don't need to do it, but if you have 12, you do, because that, it's really on a sliding scale of as you get bigger, the value becomes greater. And as you get bigger, the complexity of the assessment gets greater. But that's probably as far as I would go.
And if we're going to consider, for example, the utility of having an external assessor, let's say, facilitate these types of conversations, or gather the insight, is there utility for the smaller organizations to discuss, have an independent external expertise for this type of conversations, or is that something that utilities can take care of themselves? And I ask this because there's been a lot of obviously discussion around competency, given the resource constraints and the size of the small utilities, for having internal expertise on some of these areas. So curious if you have any thoughts on that, Dr. Fleming.
Again, I think for most organizations, it's actually helpful to have someone external, partially from an expertise, but also just in terms of the resources to be able to do it. And then I suppose the next thing is that any activity, any type of assessment would have to be, again, adapted to the size of the utility, right? So if it's a small utility, the assessment is going to be much simpler, much less labor intensive, much more qualitative in nature, with the focus on insight. And that might look like a external expert turning up for a day, or it might, in a larger, slightly larger small utility, might look like an external expert turning up for a week. But it's in that sort of range of activities. But I would suggest an external expert would be more helpful for a small utility than doing it themselves. Again, I don't know about how cost and the availability of such experts would be present, but that's a different issue.
Got it. That from a technical perspective. So thank you. Appreciate that. I wanted to just check in on Mr. Hall. Daryl, you've had your hand raised, but I wasn't sure if you, I assumed it was left over from your previous engagement, but just want to check.
Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't take it off.
Oh, that's okay. I want to make sure I checked on you then. So I put in the remaining questions. I think some of you have touched upon all of these in some shape or form, but I want to circle back to the electric utilities. And we've heard from Mr. Cisna from Pacific Core on some of these points, but just want to touch base again with Mr. Marconi and Mr. Hall on, what do you see some of these main obstacles are, and how do you foresee some of these challenges could be addressed when it comes to assessing culture? And either of you feel free to jump in first.
I can go. So I've everybody's comments today, I think, have been good. To me, the biggest hurdle is could be brought down to cost. And one thing that we really try to do is to not put cost on safety. We do what we got to do. But I think somebody already mentioned it, but giving us the flexibility to maybe get an independent instead of a larger organization to do the assessments or to do the training. I know that might require us to submit some documentation for approval, and that's fine. We certainly would do that, but we may not be able to have a full, large company, 4 or 5 people working on a culture assessment where, it may be more fitting to get us to get one approved independent or smaller company to do that. And to me, that's really the only hurdle to it, because as I said in the very beginning, it's, safety is something we don't want to be cliche. We want to live it. We want to preach it. We want to teach it, and everybody to be involved. So that's where we are.
Thank you. So it's this resource question, I'm assuming it's going to resonate with everybody that's participating. And so if I understand correctly, you might be suggesting that there be an option where the assessment's one small company and that it's external. Is that more or less what you were suggesting there'd be considerations on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
we have a company, another plant in Texas as well. So, together as a whole under the Clichy umbrella, it's not a large organization, but it's larger than certainly some of these that are here today. In California, we're, I think, right around 30 people now. Chad might verify that, but it's being able to bring in an independent or somebody, that to do it that could substantially lower the cost, and us trying to train inside or bring in another company to do it.
And I guess the other item you had brought up was the compliance piece, which I didn't want to bring in that word into this conversation, since that's something we don't want to get culture boxed into, obviously. But the framework you saw for the large utilities has some compliance requirements in terms of filings and whatnot. And it sounded that from your organization's size, that might be a challenge to comply with, bigger filings of some sort that an assessment for the large utilities could require. Gotcha. Okay. Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's very helpful. And Mr. Marconi, feel free to jump in.
I would say whatever structure you end up adopting, you have some flexibility to recognize, some of the smaller organizations, and not, when the assessment is developed, it's not, just driven by the surveys. Um,
Sorry, I don't think I caught that last. It's not just driven by the
so
surveys.
when the assessment is developed, whoever's doing the assessment, they don't, the assessment isn't driven completely by the surveys. It has to be a little more deeper dive than that. So what we've experienced with the OEIS ones are pretty much driven by the survey results. And honestly, you have a group of 5, like engineering and planning. One person can really change the whole, scale.
Yeah, and I think it sounds a little bit more of what we've been hearing from Dr. Fleming, and potentially kind of gathering some of more of this qualitative side so that you can gain better insights. It sounds like it is possible to do that without, requiring the level of resources. When one of the slides I showed had all of the different activities that SoCal Gas went through for a comprehensive assessment. And, you were to look at that as a small organization, I think your mind would be blown, and you would, we can't do something like that. But I think what I've been hearing a little bit more is that the scale can be reduced to the point that it's, a day or two of, an interview and a few interviews, and depending on the size, how that gets done. So
Yeah.
it's really how you do it.
So one of the things, and I don't know exactly how you would do it, but in previous career, I used to be in nuclear submarines, and they would come on board, some folks, and they would watch how we operated and how we discussed issues, how we confronted problems. They watched our day-to-day operations and sort of developed a sense of, hey, Captain, you're shutting down your crew, or you're not listening to other opinions. You're not allowing for forceful backup, or things like that, which you're not going to get in a survey necessarily.
Right. That's helpful.
So more looking at someone observing, how does this group operate?
That could give you the level of insights to potentially, make some meaningful change, I would assume.
Yeah.
Thank you. I appreciate you sharing that. I wanted to just jump real quick. I know Megan and the storage operators, you sort of started jumping into a few of the other questions, but you held back just because you wanted to make sure we wrapped up our discussion on the first one. So I think this would be a right time to share your thoughts.
Sure. So I think our concerns about the usefulness of the large utilities framework for this group, I think are, largely been touched on. I think because we have such a wide range of entities, sizes, annual revenues, just, number of employees, all of that. The actual cost of bringing in, an external evaluator could potentially be a hardship for some folks in this group. With the large utilities, there is a certain level of homogeneity among them, even though, they cover both electric and gas service. They're all huge, and, generally robust revenue requirements and subject to a lot of the same regulatory frameworks. Whereas here, we really have a very mixed group of entities. And so, I am not, as I sit here, even aware of the availability of third-party evaluators who would just come in for a day or two. Clearly entities exist who will do the sort of, months-long kind of like KPMG level audit of a big entity that we saw in the example for the Semper Utilities. But it may be that in practice, when we all go out to market to look for these third parties, we're having a hard time finding them. So I think the commission would need to build in some kind of a fail-safe feedback milestone, something like that, where, before there's any kind of mandate that we have this done or produce the results, that we are given the chance to go out and see if the evaluators even exist, right? I do also want to just touch on the concept of the safety culture working group that was adopted for the large utilities. I have trouble seeing how a similar framework would provide sort of, I don't know, the same kind of socialization, normalization benefits for best practices and whatever else that the big utilities are doing among this group. I'm sure there are some conceptual through lines about safety culture, but again, we do not have the homogeneity here in this group that those large utilities do. We're all operating such different types and sizes of utilities. And I would again have concerns about having to impose the costs if we're going to do, a third party facilitator for that process, the way we do with the large utilities. I think we would really need to first take a lot of time to think about what that working group would even look like and what benefits could actually be produced for this, really mixed group of entities before making the decision that this is going to happen. We did it for the big utilities, so we're going to do it for you. And the fact that none of these costs for the big utilities are recoverable from ratepayers would also need to be taken into account for this group here. The ISPs are not rate regulated. Our shareholders bear all of our costs no matter what. But that doesn't mean that additional costs are not something that needs to be factored in. But I would expect for some of the other folks here, just having to eat the costs on the shareholder side could be more of a financial hardship than it would be for the large utilities. And just in terms of mitigations, if we are going to proceed with a third party evaluator framework, which it does seem like that is the direction we're heading, I would really emphasize sort of Dr. Fleming's last observation about on the utility of having an external evaluator, that it would really have to be tailored to the specific entity, a couple days, a week, something like that, without having any plan in front of us to discuss the details, I would think that the commission would have to be ready to be incredibly flexible about what that assessment ultimately looks like for every single member of this group, and not sort of set potentially unreachable or financially infeasible goalposts up front. So I think right now, with the information we have, that's going to be a really critical mitigating factor.
Thanks, Megan. That's very useful to hear. I just want to make sure I point out that the scoping memo did have a question around, I believe it was what kind of contractor to bring on in the potential structure of that, pooling of one contractor or whatnot. But these are all questions that are being considered. So nothing's been decided, obviously. I would say, though, that the large utilities framework is pretty high level. The specificity of it is being added as the assessments are kind of taking place, precisely because it is a very new and different process. So allows for that, even at the large utility level, the ability to customize things without being prescriptive. So just want to point out that the framework itself for the large utilities is intentionally high level. Just given what we're doing here is very new, very different, and there isn't a checklist that you just go out and, yeah, this is how you do it, this is what you look at, and these are the documents you request, and these are the questions you ask. So because of that definitely that high level has been very important to keep. So thank you, I appreciate that. And then we just want to jump in real quick, and we are at time, but just want to check in with the other gas utilities and the other gas storage operators. I don't believe I heard from Guild Ranch. Not sure if there's anything you want to add. I don't know if we have who we have. Oh, Tim, go ahead.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yes, hearing you loud
Okay,
and clear.
good. So I'm Tim Morgan. I'm regulatory compliance with Gill Ranch. I just kind of echo everybody else's comments as far as the value, the obstacles, all those types of things. I think we're largely in agreement with what everyone else has said. The only thing that I would really add, and not really in addition, but just kind of expound upon, is one of the things we've kind of seen through our previous assessments, which have been surveys. I agree with Megan's statement that we do find value in them, maybe not for, this safety culture framework system that we're talking about here, but as at least internal value. And then the other thing would be that Dr. Fleming brought up was the near miss issue as far as the reporting and the quality of the reporting. We call it an IPH PSE program. It's identified potential hazards and positive safety exchanges. And all of our employees submit any number of those at each month's safety meeting. There are obviously things that have been corrected. They don't wait until the safety meeting to correct things. But when we first started it, it was kind of quantity driven. When we first put it in place, everybody needs to do 20 before the end of the year or something like that. And then we increased that over time. And one of the things we learned is the quality of those reports is far more important. You can come up with anything on a daily basis and make, whatever that number is. And so that's one of the things we've been trying to do better at is, how do we increase the quality of those? And, that could definitely be something as part of our assessment, however we end up doing that.
Thanks. There's definitely some recurring themes, so we'll definitely be noting that. So appreciate your feedback, Morgan. So I think that just the last call and final comments, if there's anything anybody wants to share from our panelists before we wrap up. Okay, well, there is a lot to digest from our conversations and parse out of, what are the challenges? I think everything's been sprinkled about. There's general agreement, obviously that sizes present a challenge for a typical assessment. I think we're generally getting a sense that potentially, as the size of the organization decreases, as you get smaller, the value may not just decrease, but it might just be different. How the value of the assessment, the value it represents might just be slightly different. One thing I got from Dr. Fleming is how you do this is not just necessarily the methods of the assessment itself, but it's how you implement them seem to be very important for the flexibility that it sounds like all of you think is necessary in order to undertake some of this. But we'll be definitely continuing to just evaluate all of your thoughts right now. But before I move on to our next steps, I wanted to, let's make sure we go through those right now, actually. So you have the scoping memo schedule, And within that schedule, there are the next steps are for parties to file comments on today's workshop, and then followed by party proposals on conducting safety culture assessments of small utilities. There will be another workshop focused on those proposals in the future, but we do not yet have specific dates for these filings. And I am not sure if ALJ Chang wants to add anything here. So let me just check in with him if he's still on the line. ALJ Chang, are you around? Yeah, so I'm just letting everybody know a little bit about the schedule. And so I'm just telling them the next steps, but since we don't have any specific dates on any of this yet, I'm sure they'll be hearing more about the dates on this next step. So I don't know if there's anything you wanted to add about that.
Yes, I'll be filing a ruling setting dates for comments and proposals. So that should be coming forward in the next week or so.
Thank you, ALJ. And with that, I will be handing it over to Commissioner Houck's office for some closing remarks.
Thanks, everybody. I'll keep it brief and just say I really appreciate everybody's candid and really insightful participation today. I know I learned a lot. I think this was a really valuable exercise. And I definitely want to say another thank you to Dr. Fleming for sharing his expertise with us today, as well as Carolina from Safety Policy Division and everyone else who helped make this workshop a success today. So I'm looking forward to discussing your insights with the Commissioner and looking forward to seeing the party proposals and comments on the workshop soon. So thanks again, everybody, and have a good one. You are muted, Carolina.
There we go. Thank you, Ben. Just want to echo your comments and thank you, all of you, for your time. Dr. Fleming, all of the utilities who made sure to bring in your representatives on the call for the roundtable. And I really appreciate everybody's feedback and being candid with your challenges so that this may be considered in the proceeding. Thank you very much, everybody. And we look forward to seeing your proposals.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks. Goodbye.